So I thought to kind of help me get warmed up, maybe help you guys get warmed up a little bit about where we currently are. We know that ash borer became established in southeast Michigan, the greater Detroit metro area, by the early 1990s, perhaps even the late 1980s. And nobody knew anything about this insect until it was detected, discovered, and identified in the summer of 2002. And since then, of course, ash borer has spread, both naturally in terms of the adult beetles dispersing, but also by people moving infested material around. And this is where we currently stand, 36 states, including Oregon, the most recent state to find their own infestation. 5 Canadian provinces, APHIS, USDA APHIS, who is in charge of regulating invasive plant pests and so forth, and movement of material between states, deregulated EAB in 2021. And so there is no longer any federal or national effort to do detection surveys. There are a few states, there's some tribal nations that are running their own surveys and so forth. States and tribal nations can impose their own external quarantines and say, yeah, you can't bring in ash firewood or ash trees. I don't think anybody's selling or buying ash nursery trees anymore. But that's kind of where things stand right now.
They still sell them in Montana, Dept.
Is that right? Well, you know what? If I need some, I am going to call up Montana, because, you know, you try to do research and you have to start with ash seeds, and I'm not going to live that long, so it's good to know. I also think this map can be a little bit misleading because all the green states look the same, and many of those states have even a one or a few localized infestations. It's not so much that the whole state is infested. And just so you know, EAB is now a bigger concern internationally as well. They found it was killing landscape trees in Moscow, Russia, as far back as 2007. And while EAB, it's actually native to the far eastern region of Russia, but that's apparently 7 time zones away from Moscow. And so they consider it to be invasive in Moscow, killed the ash trees there, and has been spreading to the west. There is a European ash, Fraxinus excelsior, that the Europeans in actually doing a lot of reforestation to kind of get some trees back after World War II and all the disturbances there. So the UK and some of the other European countries have been planting ash trees like crazy. And now they're concerned about EAB. And the red listing, it's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. When they red list a species, it means that that species is definitely in trouble. And in 2017, the IUCN red listed the entire genus of Fraxinus, which makes up, it's comprised of about 40 to 50 ash species, depending on if you're a lumper or a splitter. And that is kind of scary as well. In 2019, I have a colleague that was in Ukraine, and she had found emerald ash borer in Ukraine, and it was spreading at that point in time. Clearly, that's not the biggest issue that Ukraine is dealing with now. It was found in Estonia, which is also on the border with Russia, last year. And I know Denmark has started doing detection surveys. The European Plant Protection Organization is doing a lot of outreach now to make people aware of ash borer and to get them involved in monitoring for it. I know you all have seen EAB biology talks before. There's a couple points that become relevant later on. The beetles, the adult beetles, are going to emerge maybe as early as late May. Most of them are going to emerge in June, and they have to feed on ash leaves right away. If they don't feed on ash leaves right away, they've been under the bark for months. And so they have to finish maturing, and they also have to build up their energy and their strength to get interested in mating. And so they will nibble on ash leaves like you see there. They always take these little bites out of the margins, and they don't show any interest in mating until they have fed for about a week. And then the females actually have to feed for about another week before they can start to lay eggs. And you can see a female there. She's kind of wedged her ovipositor into the cracks and crevices of the bark there. We think in the wild they're probably laying 50 or 60 eggs, but they dole them out over the course of their lifespan. They'll lay 1, 2, 3, 1 or 2 over here, then they'll go feed and rest, and a male will probably come over and try to mate with them, and then they'll go lay a few more eggs. And so you never see a big a lot of eggs from any one female on a given tree at a given time. And then the larvae, they don't really have any choice. Wherever mama lays the eggs is where they're going to have to feed. And of course, you're familiar with these serpentine galleries, the tunnels that the larvae make. The larvae are trying to feed on phloem and a very thin layer of cambium. So the inner bark that's carrying all the nutrients made up by the foliage down the tree to the roots is what they want to eat. That's really good nutrients in there. But because phloem and xylem, the sapwood, are so tightly wedged up against each other under the tree, those galleries also etch and score that outer ring of sapwood. And ash are ring porous trees, and so the movement of water from the roots up the trunk and into the canopy gets disrupted at the same time that the phloem, which is carrying nutrients down, gets disrupted. And that's what causes the problems for the trees. By fall, as it starts to cool off, the insects have finished their feeding and they become what we call a pre-pupal larvae, and they jackknife themselves. They bend literally in half, and they're going to overwinter. Most of them will overwinter in that stage. Some people call them J larvae. They're always going to be about 1/2 an inch. So if the bark is real thick, they'll be about 1/2 an inch in the bark, 1/2 an inch from the surface. If it's a thin bark tree or they're up in a branch, they'll be a little bit into the sapwood, but it's always about 1/2 an inch from the outside of the tree. We can talk about this later, but there really is no evidence that cold temperatures cause EAB larvae to die. People keep hoping that. Minnesota just found a whole bunch of dead black ash trees in northern Minnesota. We've seen the upper peninsula of Michigan, including the little peninsula that sticks into Lake Superior. That's about as cold a winter as you want to experience, and the ash trees up there have pretty much been killed by emerald ash borer. Woodpeckers really like those pre-pupal larvae. And so when you start to see woodpeckers feeding on an ash tree about mid-November, they'll keep feeding on those larvae whenever they feel like it, all through the winter and the early part of the spring. Somewhere in May, those larvae that are in those overwintering chambers are going to transform and become adults. And then you have the adults coming out again sometime in May or June. One of the things that we've learned over the years is that an individual EAB larva needs about 10 square centimeters of phloem to make it through its feeding and development and become an adult. And of course, bigger trees have more phloem than littler trees, and we can actually use the DBH of a tree to estimate the surface area of phloem in the tree. And for whatever reason you might have in your mind, you can use that equation there and estimate how many beetles a given tree is capable of producing over time. That doesn't mean that they're all going to come out in the same year, but if you take away the really little ones, 3 to 14 centimeters, that's about a 1 to 5 inch tree. Anything bigger than about 5 inches, on average, you can get about 100 beetles per square meter of phloem. And that becomes useful sometimes if you've probably seen everybody that works on ash borer ends up peeling bark and counting larvae and looking at the number of galleries. And this, does this have a pointer? I need that pointer.
It's on the table right there.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is actual data. This is, it's actually from a forested area. It's from 40 acres. And we didn't know that ash borer was present in 2007. We thought it was, but there was absolutely no symptoms, no signs. And every year we were cutting anywhere from 8 up to 32 trees kind of systematically across this area. And you can see how larval density changes over time. Okay, so you see there's 4 years here where there's very, very few larvae, absolutely no symptoms on the tree. Here we start to see the population building. This is where you're going to start to see the very first symptoms, somewhere around 20, 25, 30 larvae per square meter. And then it goes exponentially. The population builds very rapidly on those trees. And up here, we're up at, what is that, about 70, 72 larvae per square meter. Trees at that point are declining. There's some that have died. There's others that look really bad. By the time you get to this kind of situation like this, you're at the 80 to 100 larvae per square meter, or beetles, I should say, and that's when the trees are going to die. And this is just my effort, kind of hypothetically, to remind you of what happens. So we have ash borer populations that build up. The larval density builds up over time. Usually it takes somewhere between 4, 6, maybe as much as 8 years. And as the larval density builds up, eventually the number of trees is going to decline, the amount of ash phloem is going to decline, the carrying capacity of a given site for those beetles is going to bottom out. And so there's a lot of places in Michigan where we're now in that kind of situation. I'll show you what that looks like in real data. Again, this is another 40-acre forest. You can kind of get the feel for it here. Ash, tag alders in the really wet area, some oaks, some aspens, some maples, and so forth. And we did a full inventory. We didn't cut any trees, we didn't peel any trees here, but we did an inventory of every single ash tree in this 40 acres in '07. You can see we had about 1,600 ash trees at that point. Potentially, those trees could have produced about 750,000 beetles, which is a lot in my mind. This is the number of the trees, these trees that were very small, okay, so 1 to 4 inches in diameter. We went through and we counted all the ash trees again in 2015, and then we did it one more time in 2019, and you can see this is what happens over the course of an EAB outbreak. You can also see that it took about 12 years to get to that point. But by mid-invasion time, we had lost about half of the phloem, and by 2019, all that was left was little trees. That was all that was alive in those areas. So that's, at least in my neck of the woods where I live in that region, that's what can happen over the course of an outbreak. Montana, you know, ash borer is coming at you slowly, but it's coming. And you've got it in Colorado, you got it in Minnesota, you got it in South Dakota. I don't know when it's going to get here. I'm hoping that it's not here already, but since we're really not doing much in the way of detection surveys and it's so hard to find a recently infested tree, we'll just kind of hope for the best and hope that it's not here. I don't think that there's nearly as much movement and transport by people of infested ash material as there was even 10 years ago. Other than the nurseries in Montana that are producing their own ash trees, there's not a lot of sales of ash nursery trees. Logs are not going to move very far. Commercial firewood dealers, I think they were regulated half to death over the course of that EAB, the big EAB invasion period. But people are people, and people will load up their pickup or their RV with firewood, and that's just really, you can't find it, you don't know it's there. And I can assure you, the beetles did not fly to Oregon by themselves. So, you know, you got nice country here. People come here to fish and to hunt and to recreate. And boy, you know, my money would be on finding ash borer in a campground sooner rather than later. The problem with ash borer again is that there really is nothing to see on a tree. There's no external symptoms for at least a couple years. The beetles consistently attack the upper canopy of the trees first and work their way down. So even if there's a couple of exit holes, it's going to be so high up that you're not going to be able to see it. We also know that when you have a healthy tree that has just recently become infested, most of those larvae will take 2 years to develop. This is a tree that was peeled in February. Larvae should look like this. They should be pre-pupae in February, but they aren't always if the tree is healthy. And they will feed for a second summer and they will overwinter again, and then the adults will come out when you have this. Once the trees are stressed, this 2-year development goes away, okay? And I think it's probably more common to have 2-year development where the climate is relatively cool and the growing season is relatively short, but we certainly see it in more southern areas as well. In terms of dispersing and spreading and, you know, are they going to fly into Montana? Well, probably not, but they are, in terms of insects, relatively speaking, these are good little flyers. They're strong insects. They have that kind of bullet shape to them. They're aerodynamic. And there's scientists, this is not my stuff, this is stuff other people did. You can tether a beetle on this kind of contraption called a flight mill, and you make them fly, and there's a laser that pulses, and you can track how many revolutions they make and estimate how far an individual beetle flies. And you can see this is pretty good for an insect. If I take, let's say I take Rich and I put him on a treadmill and I poke him with an electric cattle prod over and over. I bet Rich could run a marathon, you know, but realistically, neither one of us are probably going to do that in real life. So, you know, in terms of dispersal, it's really hard to track these. The Forest Service at one point tried little tiny antenna to see if they could track them. We tried mark and recapture, where you put a little dot of paint on a beetle and then see if you can trap them again somewhere else. That never worked. So we just used the galleries, the new galleries, as a proxy for where their mothers went, how far the mothers went. And we've done some field trials, big kind of field studies. I'll show you a little bit about that. And like most of the rest of us, these beetles don't want to go any further than they have to. And most of the trees that get eggs on them, most of the trees that become infested, are within 50, 100, maybe 150 meters of where the females themselves emerge. So they don't go too far, except for the ones that do. This is some of that data. This is where we had a stack of infested ash firewood. We knew one generation of beetles came out. This is the proportion of the trees that had galleries going from within 50 meters all the way out here to about 650 meters here. And so trees that are close to the emergence point get galleries as you go further and further. Yeah, there's still a tree here, and there's still a tree there, and a tree here, and there's really no, we've tried multiple times to see if there's a direction. Are they going in the direction of the prevailing winds? Is there any kind of rhyme or reason? And there really isn't. We've never gone more than 800 meters from the origin. That's a half a mile radius, because it just, you know, your area is increasing by the square. But they can certainly go a ways. And based on what we've seen, we've done a number of these kinds of studies. There is some proportion, it could be 2%, it could be 5% of the female beetles that we call the overachievers. And for reasons that are not clear, even though there's often plenty of ash trees that they could lay eggs on, they just take off and go. And that's what makes it really hard to find new infestations, is you don't know where they went. And again, those infestations are going to percolate for 4 to 6 years, perhaps as much as 8 years, before you're going to see any external symptoms, unless you get really lucky. These are the traps. This is the best kind of trap. This is the trap that is most commonly used. It's just a green funnel trap like you use for bark beetles. None of the traps are very good. This is a good one. It's still not very good. And the lures are not very good. You're baiting the traps. When we were trapping, the lures were basically compounds that are produced by ash trees, ash foliage in this case. And those lures have to compete with ash trees. And the beetles, you know, they might like that kind of smell that's in the lure, but it's not nearly as attractive as a real tree. This is a kind of funky graph that we made, but I think it's based all on field data. And what this is showing, let's say an infestation has been established for 5 years. What this means is that if you are not within less than 250 meters from where that infestation originated, there is better than a 90% probability you will not detect that infestation. In other words, the density has to build, the trees have to become symptomatic, and then and only then will you find the infestation. And so we get these satellites, you know, a couple of infested trees here, a couple of infested trees there. And when they coalesce, whatever invasive pest you're talking about, when those satellites and they all come together, then you start to see an exponential increase in density and trees really start to get hammered. Okay, so traps are not very good, visual surveys are not very good. You kind of got to think like a beetle to figure out where you want to be looking for these trees and where you're most likely to find EAB. And species, the stress level of the tree, and whether the tree is in the sun or the shade is going to drive this. And this, I mean, we could end my whole little presentation right here. Open grown green ash that are stressed are going to be what's really attractive to ash borer. We always tell people to look for woodpecker holes, because woodpeckers are better than we are at finding low densities of EAB larvae in newly infested trees. And I thought, you know, we've worked with these 4 species, but I thought we'd hone in on green ash and white ash in particular, because I know you don't have blue ash and I know you don't have black ash. So both of these species, you find a lot of them out in the woods, but they are also very common landscape trees. Marshall seedless, that's a green ash. Do you guys have autumn purple? Yep, okay, that's a white ash tree. So that's good. I was hoping this would be relevant. Don't want to talk about species you're never going to see. Everything that we've ever done, whether it's, I'm not showing you the forest data, but we had a couple of plantation studies. We've had studies with street trees where white ash were on one side, green ash were on the other side. And consistently, the beetles will go to those green ash trees first. And this one, we started with 12 green ash and 12 white ash. This is the number of exits per square meter. After a year, one of the green ash had already died. After 2 years, we were down 5 green ash trees, and you can see the density starts building up on the white ash. These were trees in a plantation. It was green ash, white ash, alternating all the way through. Green ash had a lot of larvae on it, especially if we girdled the trees. White ash, they just kind of flew by them to get over to the green ash. Same thing here, we had 5 different species in blocks, so randomly planted: blue ash, black ash, white ash, green ash, Manchurian ash, which is native to China. And green ash got clobbered, black ash was killed. There was so many larvae on there that they all basically starved to death. They killed each other. White ash, yeah, just not much. This is the green ash, one of the peeled, about a 3-inch tree. This is the white ash. So you can see a real difference there. So green ash is always going to be more preferred than white ash when they co-occur like that. You also have to think about emerald ash borer. It is, in its native range, it's a secondary pest. It's really not going to colonize healthy ash trees in Asia. And even in North America, if it's given a choice, it will go to the stressed ash trees. It really doesn't want to necessarily colonize healthy ash trees. So what happens is when the tree is stressed, and we've done this mostly with girdling studies, but it can be any other kind of stress, those volatile organic compounds, the compounds that are being produced by leaves and bark and wood, it's a whole complicated soup of different molecules and so forth. But that soup changes when the trees are stressed. And the ash borers are very good at honing in on those changes and finding those stressed trees so that they can attack them. And so this is why we kept using girdled trees. I mean, this is not new technology. We didn't have to buy super fancy, expensive equipment for the lab or anything. But girdling, where you take off the outer bark and you take off the inner bark, you're basically starving the tree to death. And it kind of slowly gets more and more stressed, and it's incredibly attractive to ash borers. If you cut into the xylem and you limit the ability of the tree to transport water, it's like the trees die too fast. It's not nearly as attractive as just girdling. And this, I think, is a cool project. This is a 40-acre forested area here. And what we did is went in the spring and girdled 3 ash trees, 3 ash trees, 3 ash trees, 3 ash trees, all green ash. And then the first week of June, we brought in some big chunks of infested ash wood, put them in the middle, let all the beetles come out, went back and counted how many exit holes there were. So we released about 1,200 ash borer beetles, figure about half of those were females. And then, beginning in about December, we went back, and all these little spots are ash trees that we felled and debarked. And what you can see is that the girdled trees, those volatiles from in the girdled trees, pulled the beetles up to where those clusters of girdled trees were, basically drove, not every ash that was girdled was colonized. And beetles, there's spillover, so they would go to trees that were near the girdled trees, but basically pulled that infestation up there. And that only works until other trees start to become stressed, whether it's environmental conditions or the population of the larvae is just building up. Once you get to this point, 20, 25 larvae per square meter, then all the trees are becoming stressed. All the volatiles out there are stressed volatiles, and your girdled trees don't work anymore. If there is a situation, and I don't know that there will be at this point, but it could be, if you really want to find whether ash borer is present in a location, you girdle a tree in the spring. It doesn't have to be a big tree. It can be a 4-inch tree. You come back in the fall, you take the bark off, and you look for larvae. And this is just this is actually based on data from the UP. Down here where you have 10 larvae per square meter, No symptoms on those trees. You'd never know they were infested. On a trap, you have less than a 10% chance of catching a beetle. But if you take that same tree and you peel it in the fall, you have about an 80% chance of finding larvae on there. The other thing is sun. These beetles love the sun. Okay, when we would try to rear them in the lab, they would always fly to the windows. If we tried to rear them in a room that had no windows, they would always fly up to the lights. They're really strongly attracted to light, and they like it hot. If it's hot and muggy and you're kind of miserable, the beetles are happy as can be. And so what that means is you have an open-grown street trees in particular, lots of sun, the beetles are going to like that. If you have any kind of an edge, the trees on the edge are going to get infested well before the trees that are shaded. We get these super canopy ash trees where the top of the canopy pokes out above all the rest of the trees, and those will get infested too because those beetles like to be up there in the sun. Okay, how we doing? Everybody still with me? Yes? Okay. Blood sugar is not too low yet? Okay. All right, so if we want to save ash trees, and I know a lot of you are arborists and you're going to be dealing with valuable landscape trees, amenity trees, whatever the case might be, there are a number of options. Cover sprays, they're not very effective. We tried them. We did all kinds of things with cover sprays. If you make all the leaves toxic, the beetles have to feed on those leaves, and so if they feed on leaves that have been covered with a pyrethroid or some other kind of insecticide, you're going to kill the beetles. But man, you start talking about spraying a tree and getting that kind of coverage, and you're going to have drift, and it's going to be dripping down on you, the applicator. There's going to be all kinds of non-target effects, and people are not going to be happy about it, and it's just not nearly as effective as systemic insecticides. How many of you use systemics? A few of you. I think that in maybe 10 years, cover sprays will be a thing of the past, and we'll be doing all of our tree, insect, pest management with systemics. These are products that you are putting either into the base of the tree or into the soil right around the base of the tree where the fine root concentration is really high, and you're letting the tree carry that material in the xylem, okay, up into the branches. And the leaves are always going to be a really strong sink. The tree is going to try to send all the water and the nutrients and stuff into the foliage, and so that is also where these systemic products go. Imamectin benzoate, a couple of major products. Triage was the first imamectin benzoate product. Arbormectin is now out there by Rainbow. Dinotephuron is a neonicotinoid, second generation neonicotinoid. It is really water soluble, and so it goes into the trees and moves rapidly up into the canopy. Azadirachtin is, it's an organic product. It's derived from the neem tree, the kernels of the neem tree. Neem trees grow in India. The nice thing about azadirachtin is it's not toxic to people, and it's not toxic to birds, little squirrels, anything like that. It's an option. This has to be trunk injected. This has to be trunk injected. Dinotephuron and imidacloprid, this is the original neonicotinoid. Lots of different kinds of products here. They can be trunk injected. They can be applied to the soil. And with dinotephuron, that can easily be applied as a basal trunk spray. Like you see here, where you spray from about shoulder height down to the base of the ground. The material moves through the bark and it gets into the xylem, and it's translocated up into the canopy of the tree. This is a soil drench, simple, fast, maybe not as effective as most of the other kinds of products. There are various kinds of ways to inject trees. This is the one that we use. This is a quick jet air where you're putting it into the base of the tree. And I will also say, I wouldn't say there's good things that have come out of ash borer, but if I was going to say that, because of ash borer and because there was so many trees and so much money involved with that, the technology to do trunk injections, the products, the chemistry to control these insects really got a boost. And so now this is hemlock. We treat thousands of hemlocks every year with trunk injection to control hemlock woolly adelgid. Imamectin benzoate, it became, I think Triage was registered in 2010, and imamectin benzoate is a game changer in terms of EAB. It's not a tremendously toxic kind of insecticide. In fact, I think it's a reduced risk compound. The molecule is for some reason particularly effective on emerald ash borer larvae and beetles for that matter. If you have a dog or a horse and you have to worm that dog or horse and you shove that big pill into them, chances are that's either imamectin benzoate or a very closely related compound. Fish farms, you know, where they grow salmon, okay, it's creepy, but fish farms get lice, fish lice. And so to control the fish lice, they will often use imamectin benzoate, or again, a very closely related compound. And you can see these are the logs from a couple of trees that were no more than 10 or 15 meters apart. You can see the difference. This is all galleries. All the phloem has been consumed. This tree is absolutely fine. This is a study that ran for 7 years. These are control trees, never treated. You can see on average, this was after we had treated the trees every year for 6 years, or we treated trees every 3 years, okay, so twice in that 6-year period. Here's the larval density in the controls. Dinotephuron basal trunk sprays. If you treated the trees every year, the larval density stayed low. If you treated it every 3 years, you didn't get any kind of control at all. Imidacloprid, this was injected into the base of the tree. Always kind of good, never very good. It's an option, but you can barely see these little bars here. This is imamectin benzoate. The high rate was the 5 mils per diameter inch. That's actually kind of a moderate rate. The low rate was the lowest rate on the label, 2.5 mils per diameter inch. And basically, there was no live larvae on those trees. It's just really, really effective. At this point, you know, I've had arborists and I've had city foresters and people say, well, we're not going to advise anybody to treat ash trees because it just doesn't work and they're just going to be wasting their money and yada, yada, yada. And that's not true. If you want to protect an ash tree, you can. All of these kinds of products and injection or soil drench or basal trunk sprays, these are all going to be somewhat effective. Imamectin benzoate is going to be real effective. Azadirachtin, you better treat the trees annually if you have a good EAB infestation going. If it's still very low, you can get away with every 2 years. Otherwise, dinotephuron, imidacloprid, certainly every year applications. Pollinators. Nobody wants to kill pollinators, right? That is not what we're about. We recognize that. We like pollinators. Ash trees and pollinators, honestly, I don't think it's a big deal. Ash trees produce pollen very early in the spring. You will have some pollinators active at that point. Meanwhile, there's a whole lot of flowering plants that are actually trying to attract those pollinators, whereas ash trees are wind pollinated and don't have anything special that's going to bring pollinators to them. I will also say that there is good evidence from the company that originally owned the patent on imamectin benzoate. That is a very large molecule, and one of the interesting things about it is that it appears to be too big to move into pollen. And so you can treat with imamectin benzoate, you can protect the ash trees, and I basically not worry about dealing with pollinators. This guy, Reed Johnson, he's at Ohio State University. His whole research program focuses on pollinator toxicology, apiculture as well, bees, and he's got a nice webinar that you can download on the eab.info website, and he gets into the importance of protecting ash trees and the fact that this is not anything that's having any effect on pollinators. This is also on the eab.info website. It's a bulletin. It's got a lot of pages to it. It covers all the different kinds of products and application methods, pros and cons, frequently asked questions, all of that. You're welcome to get to that as you need it. Print them, take copies around, whatever you want to do. If you are going to protect trees, I think the most important thing is to do it before the trees get to be really bad. Because these are systemics, they have to move in the vascular tissue. They're moving up in the xylem, and you've got to get the insecticide up into the tree so that the beetles are going to encounter it before they start laying eggs, ideally, and during the period that they're laying eggs, as well as getting to the larvae. Lot of variation in terms of treatments and how you apply things and whatnot. This can be a problem. There is some misinformation that comes out there. Sometimes it's, I don't know what motivates people, but basically you can save ash trees and you can do it very well. And I think Rich is going to talk to us about how you can, about the economics of it. Again, treat them before they get bad. Once you start to see this, once you start to see the bark cracks, the water sprouts or epicormic sprouts on the trunk, that means the larval galleries are on the trunk, and that means the chances of protecting those trees, having those trees to survive, gets lower and lower. This, I know Rich is going to get into this in some detail, so I won't say too much, but I have lived through this. When a city forester decides to go take out the ash trees because they just don't want to deal with EAB and those ash trees still look good, I don't care if they're on public property, people consider those to be their own trees and they will get very angry when trees start coming down like this. If you wait until the trees die and then decide that you're going to cut them down, you're going to be into that invasion peak where lots of trees are declining and dying all about the same 3, 4, 5-year period. Trying to get the utility companies out there to mark utility lines, trying to continue to be a good urban forester while all of that is happening gets to be very difficult. All of this stuff happens. Ash trees start to decay and soften up pretty quickly. You don't want to climb an ash tree that's been dead for more than, I don't know, year and a half or so. Rich will talk to you about this, but I just, there's a lot of ecological services that mature ash trees provide. And even if you replace that mature ash tree with another tree, it's going to be years before that replacement tree can provide all those ecological services. In terms of how to use something like imamectin benzoate, basically you only have to apply, you only have to inject imamectin benzoate every 3 years. A lot of arborists in our region do it every other year. They're being safe. They're also making a little bit more money. If you're a city forester, you can back off to every 3 years and save yourself some money, maybe be able to treat some more trees. A lot of reasons to do that. Anything that slows the growth of EAB population levels and keeps that density lower, that's going to slow the rate at which all the ash trees die. You're protecting seed sources, some genetic diversity, and this little turtle guy was in a black ash stand, and who doesn't like a little turtle like that? We don't have tremendous tools for emerald ash borer, but we have some good tools. You have imamectin benzoate. One of the things that we did in a really large-scale project we called it SLAM, Slow Ash Mortality, was to mix girdle trees to bring the beetles in and then have those girdle trees either mixed in with or surrounded by trees that had been treated with imamectin benzoate. You're trying to put the two things together and they become synergistic. Your treated trees will of course be protected, but any beetle that goes over and nibbles on a treated tree is going to die, and that's less eggs that are going to be laid on those surrounding trees. We tried this. This is kind of a, I don't know if this is a good option or not. You inject the imamectin benzoate, you give the tree a few days to move it up into the canopy, then you girdle it. And the beetles will come to that tree and the beetles will die, and any larvae that get laid on the tree will die, but the tree also dies. And so there's certain kinds of situations where this might be useful. The nice thing is that with a girdled tree, if you don't buck it up into small pieces or chip it or otherwise destroy it, the larvae that are on that girdled tree will finish developing and come out the next summer. If you use this kind of a situation, then you don't have to worry about that. We did that on some state forest land. Actually, the DNR wanted to do that, and it works great, but I don't know, you've kind of wasted your imamectin there. The nice thing about these systemic insecticides is that they are not going to harm the beneficial predators and parasitoids that are also going to be going after emerald ash borer. In fact, it may actually encourage those natural enemies to go to the trees that have larvae feeding on the trees, which may actually increase the level of biocontrol you're getting. We'll segue into that. Woodpeckers, you've got to love your woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are still consistently, every study that's been done, they are the #1 source of mortality of emerald ash borers, period. Yeah, it's mostly in the winter when you have these big, sometimes they overwinter as fourth instar larvae. More commonly, they overwinter as these pre-pupal larvae. And that's when woodpeckers are really going after them, is from about mid-November until maybe April, somewhere around in there. One of the things people talk about seeing a big increase in woodpeckers, more woodpeckers and so forth. I'm not sure about that unless the woodpeckers die in the winter. Because when they are rearing their chicks, the EAB larvae are not under the bark. They're adults and they're doing their thing. And woodpeckers won't go after those really small larvae early in the summer. They wait until fall. This is just I'm going to try to bust through this quickly. This is some data. We have 4 sites in here, white ash, post-invasion sites. The trees are, about telephone pole size or so. And we paired up a declining tree. We figured the trees were declining because of emerald ash borer. And then we paired that with a healthy tree of about the same size, cut them down, debarked them, looked at how many larvae were there and what was killing the larvae. And the woodpeckers were killing about 40% of the larvae in the declining trees that had a lot of larvae in them. In the healthy trees that didn't look like they were infested, there was still a few larvae, and the woodpeckers were getting about 10% of them. That's good. I mean, it's not going to keep the trees from dying. If you kill half of the larvae, but the tree's already so overwhelmed with larvae that it's going to be dead the next year, that's not great, but the woodpeckers are happy. We have native parasitoids. Is everybody clear on what a parasitoid is? A lot of nodding, not one naysayer. So this is an adult parasitoid here. It's a really specialized kind of wasp. And what they want to do is lay their egg into or on the body of a host insect. And so our native parasitoids have co-evolved with all these native phloem feeders, native wood borers, longhorn beetles, that kind of thing. And it takes them a while to figure out that ash trees have hosts in there that they can attack and lay their egg in there and have their larvae develop. This is a real common one, Actinicollis. They all have this bright red abdomen. They're very small, but you can certainly see them because of that red abdomen. This is a larva, Actinicollis. This is an ectoparasitoid. It feeds on the outside. Here's the head of the emerald ash borer larva. There's its body. So this parasitoid will kill this emerald ash borer larva and then they emerge as an adult. This is another one that's not very common, but you see it every once in a while. This one is maybe becoming more common. You can tell it's got this big fat hind leg. It's an internal parasitoid, so it's hard to find it. You have to actually dissect the EAB larva or wait until the adults come out. And the problem with these native parasitoids, it's good that they're learning to go after ash borer, but they typically don't get into infested trees until those trees are already really infested and declining and kind of on their way out. These are the ones that are being reared and released in all the states that have emerald ash borer now. There's 4 species altogether. 3 are native to China. 1 comes from eastern Russia. And we'll kind of go through these a little bit. Spathius agrilli. This is a larval parasitoid from China. It is no longer being released in any place that has cold winters. It is not cold hardy, so you won't be seeing this in Montana. Spathius galeni is a cousin, and it's from far eastern Russia, and it is cold hardy, and it looks like it's going to be maybe the most successful of the parasitoids. It took a while for the aphis people to figure out how to rear it, but they're doing better now, and they can produce tens of thousands in a given year. This little one, Tetrasticus, is interesting. It's the best one at dispersing. In other words, you release it in one area, and you find it some distance away, in terms even miles away. The problem is that it's really small, and it has a really small ovipositor, and so when you have any kind of thick bark on a tree, it can't get down to parasitize the larvae through that thick bark. But the cool thing is that this little wasp, she'll lay an egg, and it's something called polyembryony. That egg will subdivide into bunches of eggs, and they're all genetic clones of the mother and of the sisters. And so one adult parasitoid, Tetrasticus parasitoid, can produce a whole bunch of offspring with a single egg. And so that makes it really useful. Obius agrilli is an egg parasitoid. I mean, if you look at this, see that little black thing? That's the parasitoid wasp. It's very hard to track. You have to scrape bark, and then you get the scraped bark, and you look at it under a microscope, and you try to find an egg, and then maybe it's an EAB egg, and maybe it's something else. They're probably doing some good. It's just really hard to know. And again, this is the same 4 sites I mentioned earlier. There had been multiple releases of Spathius galeni, Tetrasticus, and Oobius in each of those 4 sites, 14 to 24 times in previous years, again in 2021 and 2022. And these were biocontrol scientists, so the timing of the releases was pretty much optimized. And what we found is there's just not a whole lot of parasitism going on. 10 to 15% of larvae in the trees were killed by parasitoids. Didn't matter how many ash borer larvae were in there, the condition of the trees or anything like that. External parasitoids, these are pretty much all the native parasitoids. The internal blue bars is pretty much this Phasgonophora. Not great, it helps. Not super great, but it certainly helps. So I think there was a period where biocontrol was perhaps being almost sold as this is going to be the solution to EAB, and if you just release parasitoids, things will be better and it will get good. And that's not exactly true. They help, absolutely. The native ones, there's a learning curve. It takes them a while to get keyed into ash trees and EAB. The non-native ones, the ones from Asia and Russia, the good thing is that they're turning out to be real specialized. There hasn't been any examples of non-target effects where they're going after native insects, and so that's really good. Again, you can use those insecticides and you can release biocontrol. Absolutely do it in the same kinds of locations. Woodpeckers are not going to be harmed. They'll never come into contact with the insecticides, the systemic insecticides. They are not interested in dead larvae. Same thing with the parasitoids. They will not parasitize a dead larva. It has to be a live larva, so you're okay there. And even the egg parasitoids, they're laying their egg into an EAB egg on the bark, and so they never come into contact with the systemic insecticides. So again, you know, you can put this together, and places are doing this. Oregon, I understand, has a multifaceted IPM type approach that they're going to try with some injections of imamectin benzoate, biocontrol, removing some trees, girdling some trees perhaps. And we always show these pictures because I think they are just so cool. This is Dan Herms when he was at Ohio State. He's a good friend and a colleague. He's now the vice president at Davy Tree. And he had the foresight to take this picture looking down a street in Toledo. And these are all big green ash trees, beautiful. And 3 years later, this is what it looks like. And this is what you don't want to see happen. And I don't know where all the ash trees are here in Billings, but I have seen some just walking around and looking around. I know there's some green ash street trees that are definitely worth saving. So this is my last slide. You know, you're here. I know you got to get credits, but I also think you're here because you're interested in protecting trees, and you kind of want to have a way to proceed if and when ash borer is discovered here. And so, you know, if nothing else, anybody that's a city forester, if you're taking care of trees in a business park or anything like that, know what you have. Where's the green ash trees? Which ones are stressed? What's the diameter of them? If you have to estimate what it's going to cost to treat those trees, you need to know what the diameters of the trees are, right? Funding, I've seen the most interesting one was watching Chicago go through their conniptions, trying to decide what they were going to do because they have tens of thousands of ash trees there. And trying to get the people that control the funding to take care of those trees. They eventually are treating lots and lots of trees, but man, it took a while. It was like pulling teeth slowly. So don't let that happen to you guys. Everything else here, I think a lot of this is just common sense. You can't release parasitoids until you have EAB established. But when it is established, then get in touch with the APHIS people. The biocontrol lab is in Brighton, Michigan, and you can find out how to go about that. I would also say if you're going to take a tree out, you know, unless it's really a city tree and it's on a city corner, you can think about girdling those trees and get a year's worth of use out of them, attract the beetles there. when they're girdled, take them out, chip them, burn them, do something to destroy them, and take a big chunk of the adult beetles out with them. With that, I am finished. Thank you.